Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple of data points, we use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So in today's show, we're going to be focusing on one issue, and that is the protests in China. We thought that merited the entire show rather than just one segment. And the data point there is 23. That is the number of major demonstrations, as verified by CNN, in China since last week. That's across 17 Chinese cities, including the capital of Beijing and the financial center of Shanghai.
Down with the Communist Party, they shouted on the streets of Shanghai. An eruption of anger against a one-party state in power for over 70 years.
Thousands of people blasting the government's COVID policies in China's largest public demonstrations in decades. Now the U.S. Embassy in China is telling American citizens in the country to, quote, keep a 14-day supply of medications, bottled water, and food on hand. Foreign correspondent Maggie.
The protesters are opposing the government's zero COVID policy and the extreme lockdowns that the government is still using to keep outbreaks of the coronavirus in check. The protests amount to the most significant public demonstrations that China has seen since the 1989 protests at Tiananmen Square that produced a terrible crackdown by the government in response. It's not yet clear how the government is going to respond to these protests, but we thought we would look at some of the economic questions surrounding both the protests themselves and the potential response by the government. So, Adam, I mentioned that the protests are sparked by the zero COVID policy of the government, and that in turn is made necessary by China's inability so far to vaccinate the country at sufficient levels. So, yeah, just a basic question. Why hasn't China been able to organize a successful vaccination campaign? You know, the protests are pointing out that it is a big authoritarian government. So, yeah, why can't they manage this?
I mean, it is the trillion-dollar question. It's a trillion-dollar question because it moves the entire world economy. And I have to say, I think with all due modesty, we should simply say that we don't have a very good answer to this question. It's one that, I've been desperately searching for some inside good reporting on it. And I think the majority of observers say that it is, in some senses, mysterious. It's truly, I think, a profound policy failure. Because China does have vaccines that would work. So that, it's often said, well, if only their problem is they've gone vaccine nationalists and don't have one of our trick Western mRNA vaccines, or have been too proud to import Western vaccines, all of which would no doubt have helped, and they have been notably sluggish in licensing the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine, and it's been licensed for use by foreigners but not by Chinese in Hong Kong and so on. I mean, it's a bit of a ridiculous situation, but that can't be the fundamental cause, because the fact of the matter is that the Sinovac and Sinopharm vaccines, which were early on the scene, if boosted, so not just the original 2-course dose but with a third dose, are perfectly adequately effective in covering against extreme illness and death. So they would do the job if they could get 3 doses of the national Chinese vaccines into people's arms. But the astonishing thing is that only about a half of the Chinese population has vaccine-based immunity in that sense, so 3 doses. And initially, the vaccines were limited to people under the age of 60. It was an extraordinary decision to focus on the workforce rather than the elderly population. So there is a substantial share of, indeed a majority of those over 80, who essentially have no vaccine protection. And those are, as we all know, and as everyone has known all along, the most vulnerable group. And only now, really, I think, under the emergence of a true impasse. I mean, there have been energetic moves to increase vaccination throughout this year as it became clear that Omicron is sweeping in. And the crucial thing to realize is, as it were, that we're dealing now with Omicron, which is less deadly than Delta, but vastly, vastly more infectious than the COVID, which the Chinese successfully contained in 2020. So it's crucially important to build new defenses. And as Omicron swept in, they began to realize this and ramped up the pace of vaccination, but then came to a standstill again over the summer. and have now apparently resumed vaccination. But this regime, which is capable of extraordinary levels of control in so many respects, and imposed this incredibly draconian lockdown on Shanghai, 27 million highly energized, mobilized people were locked down for weeks on end. It can't get, apparently, vaccination jabs, 3 of them in quick succession, into the arms of the elderly Chinese population. It's truly staggering. I mean, having said that, and it will go down in history as a great failure of Chinese policy, and it conditions everything else, because it means that zero COVID at this point, and this is a point I want to drive home repeatedly in this segment, is not some capricious, vanity project of Xi Jinping, who's obsessively, in the business of stamping down COVID. It is currently their best tool in what is an incredibly dangerous situation, because they have essentially an immuno-naive population. And when we say, why did the Chinese not develop a successful vaccine drive, we should, after all, remember that our quote-unquote successful vaccine drive, which has now enabled us to return to ordinary life, is simply what they got to with zero COVID in 2020. Remember back to 2020, the only place in the world that had a normal existence was China in 2020. And we got there by way of an attritional process in which we don't just have vaccine immunity, but we have herd immunity as a result of the exposure of the vast majority of the population to COVID. And that cost in the United States alone 1 million lives. So this successful vaccine model, which we hold out, is a disaster from China's point of view. They are still trying to avoid what happened to us, and the benchmark for them is 1 million deaths. That's what they're trying to avoid. And we have not actually yet seen whether any of the vaccines, mRNA or the Chinese version, even with full boosting, how they stand up in a population which basically has zero exposure to COVID in any form, right? Because in the European and American, Latin American cases, the vaccines piled on top of considerable amounts of natural exposure, quote unquote, to the virus. In China, because of the success of zero COVID, really virtually no one has any exposure to COVID, and they're building up now rapidly, but the natural exposure levels are really rather low. So they're in uncharted territory, but your question is absolutely on point, and it is the question I think that will be asked about the CCP regime forever after, is how on earth did they not see the necessity of moving to 3 doses for the elderly population in particular as soon as they could possibly provide them, which would have been as early as last year.
Yeah, when you say that the policy is necessary, I mean, it gets me wondering what exactly are the other possible, even just speculate on what the other possible reasons for not pulling off this vaccination campaign are. I mean, clearly they're comfortable with coercive measures, as you pointed out, with these lockdowns, and they're capable of other logistical efforts that are taxing. I mean, the lockdowns themselves are logistically taxing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is considerable squeamishness about the medicines themselves, right? The regime is rather, I think, foolishly indulged in and allowed a variety of different conspiracy memes about vaccines to circulate, including about Western vaccines. But there has, in a sense, been a destabilization of confidence in vaccines. What the regime didn't do was to create a kind of united front. The vaccines are good. All vaccines are basically, this is essentially the same as the AstraZeneca one, and the AstraZeneca one came from Oxford, so it could be, and the Russian one is essentially the same too. It's like the Sputnik version, and so what the regime didn't do was engage in a broad front. Vaccines are good. Everyone should have them. Chinese should have them in the same basis as everyone in the West. Instead, it was this sort of vanity project vaccination politics, which I think is really destabilizing.
Yeah.
And they've become a victim of that to a degree. I think this is also revealing the fact that Chinese authoritarianism, in many respects, is not quite how we imagine it. And as you see that also in the protests where really, really quite casual abuse is directed at the Chinese police. And that's far more common in everyday life in China than you would imagine. So the capacity of the regime to actually reach in a society which still venerates the elderly, to a very considerable extent, the resistance of families to exposing their cherished family members to what the regime itself has allowed to become anathematized medical interventions, I think is at the heart of this. And so they've shrunk from doing it because it would be considered a highly, highly intrusive thing to do. And it is, of course, rather different to police people individually to crack down on a Tiananmen Square demonstration, or literally to coerce every single elderly person in China to have 3 jabs in their arm. Those are 3. I mean, coercive is not these are 3 rather different forms of coercion.
So let's say outbreaks do happen across China. Let's say they loosen the zero COVID policies, loosen the lockdowns, and infections spread. As we've seen in other countries around the world, a lot of the people infected are going to need medical services. So yeah, what is the state of the Chinese healthcare system, Adam? I mean, how much does China spend on its hospital system compared with other countries?
Well, I mean, it spends what you would expect a middle-income country to spend, broadly speaking. It's not exceptional in that respect. It's just that puts it in harm's way. So it does not have anywhere near the kind of, it has, say 1/10 the number of ICU beds that Germany does per 100,000 people. It has 1/4 of the ICU beds that the United States does. It has far too few nurses. So China has a highly effective and successful health system in the sense that its life expectancy as a result of the COVID disaster actually exceeds that of the United States currently. So at a very broad-based general practitioner level, the system works especially well for people in the cities. But one of the reasons why the regime has so doggedly stuck to the zero COVID policy is that they saw in Wuhan in 2020 what happens when a successful but still basically middle income country is hit by a disaster like this. And that is that its health care system does risk becoming spectacularly overwhelmed. And the problems are even worse in the countryside of China. So where the provision with hospitals and doctors is roughly half what it is in the cities. So it's a highly unequal society. About 500 million, 500 million Chinese remain in rural areas which are underserved. And if you look at the experience, not of Hong Kong, which is a rich city, but if you look at the experience, say, of the United States, ultimately, the mortality that piled up from COVID in the United States was much heavier in Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas than it was, say, in Florida or New York, where we initially expected the mortality to be highest. So it's in poor, underserved communities in the end that this virus does most damage once the infection takes hold. And I think that is the concern in China, that the pandemic will ultimately expose this weakness. It's hard to call it a weakness given their life expectancy is now higher than that of the United States, and they are a country at a much lower level of income, regardless of how you measure it. But would this system take the blow of a pandemic? That I think is very much open to question. Part of the problem is the funding of the system largely requires private funds. And so people in Wuhan were very late to go to the hospital because they were afraid of being bankrupted by hospital bills if they ended up in hospital. So this is a fragile system. It extends insurance only to the most privileged workers in the cities, hundreds of millions of people, but a fraction of the overall population. And so another element of the calculus on the part of Beijing right now is exactly the same flattening the curve kind of logic that we all endlessly debated in 2020, namely how can they contain the impact. That, I think, is the thing to wrap our heads around here. No doubt there is Xi's ego and the political reputation of the regime at stake, but this is also back to 2020 in terms of the basic public health dilemmas.
Got it. We do need to take a break here. And we will be back in a second to talk about how do protests in this kind of situation produce change. So if we were to speculate on the zero COVID policy staying in place and the associated lockdowns staying in place as well, that got me wondering, how do normal Chinese people deal with that situation? I mean, have the lockdowns been compensated by economic policy in ways that we might remember from the lockdowns here in Europe or the United States? There were subsidies for salaries and other kinds of assistance to businesses. Are Chinese businesses and workers receiving assistance and subsidies from their government?
The crucial thing, I think, to say so far is that the Chinese, after all, haven't had to do a nationwide European-style lockdown. They've done it city by city. And of course, Chinese cities are gigantic. Shanghai, 27 million people, is larger than the vast majority of European countries. So these are very large entities, and they do indeed provide a combination of support for businesses, labor law protections, employment protections, which support businesses, but they have not yet had to sustain a 6-month economic crash, right? That's just not been China's experience so far. If they were to have to do that, it would be epic in its consequences, both for China and the world economy. In the spring of 2020, they did a lockdown nationwide that lasted for maybe 2 to 3 weeks, and it was effective enough to stop COVID. So they've not dealt with the full fiasco of a nationwide pandemic requiring a lockdown across the entire economy. And when they do face that, I think it's very difficult to see how they could avoid similar subsidy regimes, because Chinese employers do have legal obligations to pay wages, to continue paying wages for at least one salary period. And after that, they're required to pay a kind of minimum basic package to their workers, which is fixed to the local minimum wage. But many Chinese cities don't have minimum wage provisions. The overall welfare state in China is very inadequate. And there are hundreds of millions of migrant workers who aren't even in this system, many of whom are employed in factories and construction work, and they are incredibly vulnerable. So China is really, as I keep saying, embarking on the disastrous road to discovery that the West embarked on in 2020, and will have to improvise. One problem that is particularly pressing for the regime is the giant cohort of university students who are emerging into the labor market. It's 11 million people this year in China who are entering a labor market that is in very bad shape. And youth unemployment in China is pushing towards 20%, which is from the Chinese point of view, a truly catastrophic level. So that's been an object of particular concern, with subsidies from the government announced to support the hiring of college students in particular, to ease their anxieties about their future, because as we know, the losing your foothold in the labor market as you exit college in particular has disastrous consequences for people's long-term earning. The most extreme Chinese response to the crisis, and this is what has caused the outbreak of protests, which started after all with the protests at Foxconn, is the so-called closed loop system, where the question of subsidy doesn't arise because the factories and the offices go on working. It's just that the workers don't get to go home. And that's really the most draconian model, which avoids the problem of needing a public subsidy, because the units of production essentially function then as quarantine units. And I think it was the threat of that model being extended on a large scale that caused the extraordinary rioting and scenes of protest at Foxconn. Because stories of the extraordinarily horrible conditions in these closed loop factories have circulated widely in China. Despite media censorship, the regime cannot prevent news of those conditions spreading. And workers are, for obvious reasons, desperate to avoid being essentially locked into their factories for weeks, if not months on end. So all of those models have been attempted, including the closed loop, the most radical one, which apparently was modeled on the Winter Olympics and then extended outwards to chunks of the economy. But China is going to face very serious questions. The problem from their point of view is that the broader economic setting is so problematic, right? So once upon a time, you would have thought that Beijing would be trigger happy with huge stimulus like they did, for instance, in 2008. But on the contrary, right, in this year, or rather last year, they embarked on the program of bringing down the extraordinary housing bubble very deliberately, deflating that, and on the other hand, cracking down on tech companies. And both of those are, of course, extremely bad signals. They have very bad impact on the labor market in the short run. They were thought of as stability measures by Beijing, but now coincide with this Omicron wave. And that triple whammy of the crackdown on the tech oligarchs, the effort to bring down the housing bubble, and Omicron together make a perfect storm.
Meaning they feel like they maybe couldn't afford to kind of bail out the economy in the ways they have in the past.
It's not so much a question of affording, I think, because this is a closed loop monetary system. They can finance it. It's just it requires policy to go into reverse, because their standard method for stimulating the economy was to launch a big infrastructure and housing push. And that runs counter to the entire logic of deflating the housing bubble. And so they find themselves caught, if you like, in a policy conflict, which will be quite difficult to resolve. And concretely now with a collapsing real estate sector. So, from the point of view of consumer confidence, and we see this in the consumer figures for China, consumer confidence in China appears to have collapsed. Consumer spending has not come back to pre-COVID levels. What that's telling you is Chinese households are accumulating ever greater levels of saving, presumably. And that's also one of the cushions which is seeing China through. I mean, Chinese households, certainly those with more steady employment, have, by Western standards, enormous levels of saving. So those are also reserves that they can tap before needing, urgent public support.
So to turn back to the protests themselves, I should have emphasized just how far some of these protesters are going and the demands they're making, and in terms of how they're challenging the legitimacy of the Chinese government itself. Many are holding up blank sheets of paper as a protest against censorship. They're chanting, we need human rights, we need freedom. Some are calling for Xi Jinping to step down, trying to humiliate the government by singing the Internationale, the socialist anthem. This got me wondering, and this is a broad question, but how do protests in this kind of situation produce change in dictatorships? I mean, what are the potential calculations that protesters are making? I mean, what kind of theory of change might be informing their actions on the streets?
Yeah, I mean, this really got me thinking, because I think, and it's again, I think modesty is called for in our ability to assess this, and also the fact that we speak from a position of safety, whereas the demonstrators in China, frankly, the Chinese demonstrators, both inside and outside China, are running really rather considerable risks in engaging in these incredibly imaginative protest forms, which we are celebrating on the outside vicariously by way of Twitter and social media and so on. For them, for many of the people involved, this is a turning point in their lives, and their career prospects and everything else will never be the same again if their faces are, identified by the regime. So the stakes are incredibly high, and one feels, sort of modest in one's ability to comment from the outside, I think, on what's going on and what the motivations are. I think there are at least three, aren't there, different strands of protest here. I mean, one is to do with the conditions in the closed loop factories. So those were the Foxconn riots, which are I think the largest in terms of participation and violence and significance from the point of view of the economy, because those are working people in one of the key factories in the global smartphone chain. So that's one dimension of this. And protesting and even strikes by Chinese workers are not entirely unusual, but this was a particularly strategic plant. The issue is highly political, and the scale was really remarkable. So that's one facet. The sense one gets of those protests is that they are not extremely politicized, and they are fundamentally about get me out of here. You cannot be serious. There's no way I'm going to continue working at this plant. And no, I'm not going to accept being locked into the factory. And this is an indignant, grassroots protest and a question of individual survival, and people, trying to get home to their families and out of this system. That's one element. Then there is, as it were, broad-based indignation about the sheer perversity and coercive violence of zero COVID, which of course was then symbolized by the news of the horrible fire in Xinjiang and Urumqi, where 10 people are alleged to have died as a result of the failure and the inability of the fire services to reach them because of the COVID lockdown situation. And this unleashes a wave of indignation on the part, I think it's fair to say, of Chinese everywhere about the absurdity of the conditions that they're being required to live under. The question, of course, is, if you focus on COVID, what is the answer? What is the alternative? And the only way out from that is a policy of vaccination. But of course, it spills over into a much more, and this is maybe the third strand of the protest, a much more broad-based indignation following the party congress at the way in which Xi has transformed party rule in China towards this one-man personalistic circus. And the three things, as you say, are all overlapping with each other. But in terms of scale, if you like, the workers' protest is the one that has been most dramatic. In terms of breadth of feeling, I don't think there's any doubt that tens of millions of people in cities across China are profoundly, infuriated by, if not hundreds of millions of people, infuriated and terrified at the prospect of Shanghai-style month-long lockdowns. And then there is a third element, which is this much more politicized protest, which includes, of course, resistance to the regime for obvious reasons. It's a hugely abusive and oppressive regime, but extends also as far as, if you think about the protests outside China, of Xinjiang separatism, for instance, where you essentially have nationalist opinion calling for the separation of Xinjiang from China. And all three things can be at work, in the protests at the same time. Is there a coherent theory of change? No, there isn't. And is this the same sort of movement as Tiananmen? I really think it's important to say how different this is, because Tiananmen was months of encampment on, it's difficult. I was trying to think, is there a location in the United States which has the symbolic significance of Tiananmen Square? And there really isn't, right? In fact, there's few European countries where you could say that is the center of political power, the place you can occupy. And that is what Tiananmen Square is for China, and it was occupied by an openly rebellious horde of thousands and thousands of students for months on end, and then they sent the army in, right? So that juxtaposition of a kind of almost revolutionary style, I mean, it's maybe closest to the occupations of the plazas that you saw in Spain, for instance, during the Eurozone crisis. A genuine challenge to state authority in territorial terms. We're very far from seeing anything even remotely like that so far. And I think that should also condition our thinking about what kind of a protest this is.
Yeah, you mentioned Tiananmen Square, and that prospect has been raised of a potential crackdown by the government on protesters. We are an economics podcast, so I obviously don't want to minimize the stakes here, but I did want to ask, what is the mechanism by which a crackdown of that kind would affect the Chinese economy and the global economy from there? I mean, would the impact come in the form of the crackdown itself, or more the kind of second order international response, the sanctions, et cetera, that would likely come in the wake of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really ghoulish conversation, this, isn't it? And I think we should be clear about this. On the one hand, what's at stake here are 1 million plus potential COVID deaths if this gets out of hand and is not managed properly. The zero COVID issue is a matter of life and death, and that we should be very clear about that fact. And life and death on a huge scale. If we say we want China to go down our path, what we're saying is we're asking China to accept our kind of death rate, which is 1 million people in the United States. And on the other hand, yes, when you think about the protests and the potential regime response, your mind turns to Tiananmen Square, which is one of the great massacres in recent political history. I think it's very unlikely that this kind of protest will elicit that kind of response, because that was a true martial law style operation. The current situation is very remote from that. It'll be, and it already is. Phone calls from the police. We saw you at a demonstration. What were you doing there? Knocks on the door. Arrests. It's not clear exactly how large scale the arrests are so far, but of course they can take their time and do it whenever they feel like it. The effect of this is like the COVID crisis in general, I think. And I think that's really the driver here, is that it increasingly separates societies from each other. It makes travel difficult. We were on the cusp of beginning to feel that perhaps airline travel back to China was going to become more easy. And it's quite unlikely that that will be the case, given their infection rate right now. Hong Kong opened up for a while, and it's very unclear whether that can be sustained. And the consequence of that is that simply cities like Shanghai and Hong Kong, which have hitherto been the great, as it were, mingling spots, the melting pots of a globalized China, will become less and less attractive for Western firms, for global firms and global people to congregate, whether it's at university or in business or in global cultural gatherings, whether it's art shows or music festivals, and that I think is the long run effect. That's the effect that's going to be largest. Obviously, if there is, and it's hard to imagine, but were there to be an egregious, spectacular repressive thing like Tiananmen, it would further cloud relations. But I think far more pervasive and effective over the long run will be just the question of ordinary COVID lockdowns and how they're managed. And if China has to go the route, which it currently looks like it's going to have to do, because even if they accelerate vaccination, containing this is going to involve very serious measures for months to come, then the consequences will be the reverse of what many were hoping for at the beginning of 2023, namely an easing of the lockdown in China.
Well, obviously, we hope it doesn't come to the worst in any case in China, but we will keep an eye on it. And so, yeah, won't be surprised if we return to the subject in the weeks ahead. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It is produced by Laura Rossbrow-Tellum and Rob Sachs. Our social media manager is Claudia Tatey. The executive editor of FP Podcasts is Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested not just in Adam Tooze, but news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Ones and Tooze listeners even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That is TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love hearing your feedback. You can send us voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or you can email us, podcasts@foreignpolicy.com, or tweet us. That's at Ones and Tooze Pod. Thanks very much for listening, and we will see you back in your feed next week.